Middle Ages is probably one of the most contentious periods among a lot of people, both historians and more casual observers. Traditionally, it has been viewed very extremely, as either a period of extraordinary darkness and ignorance, or one of romantic values like honor, societal order, and chivalry. So you see stuff like Hollywood movies where everything is dull, grey and muddy, or people trying to sell how medieval peasants were actually more free and healthy than modern men, and that the period wasn't actually so bad, usually accompanied by AI-generated images. One of the problems is that people usually narrow down this period to a few select examples, whereas the actual Middle Ages spanned between circa 500 AD to 1500 AD. That's a rough 1,000 years, during which things not only changed, but fluctuated. Even the designation of a medieval period can be problematic and misleading, because it assumes that the millennium between the so-called fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance and early modern period was extraordinarily dark, horrific, and ignorant, whereas antiquity and the early modern period were at times just as horrific or even more horrific than the most infamous episodes of the Middle Ages. Nowadays, this division into clearly defined periods is mostly done for convenience. It becomes easier to talk about what happened, not just in a casual manner, but even in scholarly research. This is why archaeologists and academics speak of a Viking Age, even though this period concerned so much more than actual Vikings. It just becomes easier to talk about something when everyone agrees on what to call it. Don't need to make a fuss about it. All of that said, the issue with bunching the Middle Ages all into one period is that some facets of it get neglected. Discussions on medieval slavery primarily concern how serfs were different from slaves, or how slavery ended. You see, between the 11th and 13th centuries, slavery came close to disappearing from the European continent, a remarkable shift in the history of mankind. The slaves were instead turned into tenant farmers or serfs, a person, usually a farmer, bound by a servile contract to the lord owning the land. The freedom of these serfs and farmers varied immensely by circumstance, but in general, it was preferable to being a slave. The problem here is that by focusing entirely on the transition from slavery into serfdom, one might neglect the centuries of slavery that plagued the European continent, and also how slavery persisted, both within the European center, but especially on the fringes, the Mediterranean, Russia. Indeed, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the 19th century, slavery never truly ended in the Western world, and there was a direct continuation between the Roman latifundias to the cotton plantations of the American South. This video will primarily be an overview of European medieval slavery, covering both the philosophical and societal backgrounds which led to slavery, a timeline of slavery during the Middle Ages, how it evolved and fluctuated, but also the specifics, what slaves were used for, how they were acquired, who owned them, and how free or unfree they actually were. This is an enormous topic, so this is just going to be the first episode in a longer series, which will cover different regions and timeframes. But this is a good starting point. One of those things you often hear about history is how nationalism did not exist before the 19th century. It is definitely not that simple. Some countries, especially England, developed a national character centuries earlier, and there were stirrings of nationalism many times before. And of course, ever since recorded history, people have always grouped depending on the way they look, behave, and speak. Instead, it is more correct to say that with the growth of urbanization, centralized governments, and the industrial ease of communications, trains, reliable roads, telecommunications, people began to place a bigger importance on their cultural, national identity, instead of just the local. Part of the reason is because of the modern social safety net. Nowadays, the social contract concerns the citizen's relation to his government. We rely on the centralized government for almost everything, and vice versa. But before the growth of centralized governments, people were more reliant on each other. Society was structured around personal social relations. Clan societies. You had your immediate family, but you could also form social bonds with friends, foreigners, even a powerful lord. This explains why it was so common in the Middle Ages for people to capture, sell, or own slaves of their own culture. People back then identified more with their immediate family and social relations, rather than how they looked or spoke. To be a member of pre-modern society, you had to have social relations. If you didn't have them, you were an outsider. You were looked down upon and considered an unperson, non-existent, socially dead. Practically speaking, this can be observed in Visigothic law from the 7th century. If a married person was enslaved, their spouse had the right to remarry after only 1 year, as if their partner had actually physically died. Social death, like normal death, turned you into nothing but a body, a bag of meat and bones. A common legal term was mancipium, which is, grammatically speaking, gender neutral, as if the person was a thing, an object. This gave your owner the right to exploit you however they pleased, which often involved horrific punishments, or even physical scarring as a mark of status and possession. A constant reminder of what you were, since a free person could not be harmed in such a manner without repercussion. Social death made you susceptible to slavery, since you literally did not have anyone to protect you, and those who wanted could take and exploit you. So the first method in which to create a slave is to socially isolate them. This was usually done by warriors, taking captives by force. This was perhaps rooted in the terminology of slaves. During the Middle Ages, they were most commonly called servi, of which the bishop Isidore of Sevilla wrote in the 7th century. Servitus is named from saving, servare, for among the ancients, those who were saved from death in battle were called servi. The ancients believed that those who were defeated in battle were bound to die. Thus, the survivors were socially dead, and by sparing them from execution, their lives were therefore owned by the would-be executioner. Of course, not all captives taken as slaves were battle-hardened men. In the Middle Ages especially, the men were often just executed, whereas the women and children were taken and shackled in their stead. Servus was the most common medieval word for slave. It is the root of the words serf and servant. However, there wasn't just one type of slave, as we'll find out later. Different slaves had different assignments and were afforded different levels of freedom. A slave could be a laborer, but also an overseer, a skilled craftsman, or a teacher. In certain regions in certain times, they might be referred to by different titles instead of our convenient umbrella term, slave. So, where does it come from? During the High Middle Ages, between the 11th and 13th centuries, most servi transitioned into free or semi-free tenants, who farmed someone else's land and paid them a fee. The serf, as we understand them. So a new term was needed in reference to socially dead, objectified, and unfree laborers. Since a slave was so commonly a person separated from their community, it has been popular throughout history to take people from other ethnic groups. There is always a us and them element to slavery, since you need to separate them from your own group in order to make them socially dead, and so to justify possession, use, and abuse. So taking someone who looked, spoke, or acted differently and making them a slave was logical, and so was using the term of their ethnic designation as a word for slave. This is why Negro was often synonymous with slave in the early modern period, and it also lies rooted in the origin of the word Welsh. Welsh stems from the Old English weal, which comes from a Germanic word meaning stranger. Derivatives also appeared in the Nordic languages. Weal appears in Anglo-Saxon documents both as a designation for slaves and Welshmen, whom they primarily took their slaves from, whereas the Welshmen called themselves Cambri. And then, of course, most obviously, we have the word slave. It comes from Slav, since so many, if not the majority of slaves during the Middle Ages, were taken from Slavic peoples in Central and Eastern Europe. Slav appeared as a term for slaves simultaneously in Greek, Western, and Muslim sources. And after the transition of servus into a tenant, slave became the new popular Western word. It is generally agreed upon that the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, whereas the Eastern Roman Empire would continue for another millennia around the Hellenic heartland. However, it is a bit more complicated. The Roman Empire isn't a dead civilization akin to ancient Egypt, the Tripolia culture, or Mississippians.
And the Romans? Where are they now?
You're looking at him, asshole.
There is a kind of a point to that clip. Many, if not most, Roman cities are still inhabited, and most of what constituted the former empire speaks languages derived from Latin. This isn't a coincidence. When barbarian peoples like the Franks, Goths, Burgundians, and Lombards conquered the former lands of the empire, or were invited, they largely inherited the former institutions, legal frameworks, religious traditions, and merged with the local Latin-speaking peoples. There is a general idea that the collapse of Western society after the fall of the empire was caused by barbarians, like the extreme decentralization and de-urbanization, cities becoming abandoned and Europe turning more agrarian. But this trend had already been occurring within the late empire. Urban life disappeared, towns and villages ceased to exist, the stone and tile withered, while smaller villages of timber and earthen floors grew up around rivers and trade junctions. Ancient fortifications from the Bronze and Iron Age were reoccupied. The late empire simply wasn't the same place as the one from 4 centuries earlier under Augustus. Just how the 21st century United Kingdom is different from 17th century England. All of this to say that the barbarian kingdoms inherited the Roman institution of slavery, which does warrant a brief discussion, since it laid the groundwork for medieval slavery. Rome was not the first human culture to own slaves, but the Roman institution of slavery was different. When Rome started out as a small city-state, slaves were possessions of individual families and often considered a part of them. This phenomenon is both ageless and universal, and has largely been the norm throughout history. This began to change when Rome expanded into an empire. Non-stop conflict with neighbors and distant lands allowed for an incredible influx of forced labor. By the 1st century Anno Domini, slaves were found in the fields, homes, workshops, and offices. Any freeman with a modicum of money was able to own at least one slave, with the wealthy keeping hundreds or even thousands. These were organized into large estates, ranging from smaller ones run by free farmers, even slave overseers, to the massive latifundia, a progenitor of the plantation. Thus, the Roman institution of slavery was large-scale and non-personal, a concept which the Western world would inherit and carry on until the 19th century. Conflict was the primary source of slaves, meaning that the slave population skyrocketed during periods of war and plummeted during lengthy bouts of peace. So between the 3rd and 5th centuries, slavery almost seemed to be on its way out of Rome, slowly being replaced by semi-free tenant farmers, colonus, akin to later serfs, and treatment of slaves seemed to be improving. This appears to be a historical trend. As the external supply of slaves decreases, the existing population becomes more valuable, so treatment improves, and it becomes more profitable to give them more freedom. Abolishment of slavery has seldom been about ethics, as we'll come to discover. When the Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the decentralized successor states were embroiled in constant conflict, which ensured a brutal re-emergence of slavery. With larger cities being almost abandoned, slavery took on a more rural character, with the empowered estates employing large numbers to work the fields. These estates were owned both by old Roman nobility and new barbarian conquerors. They blended the old Roman institution with their own Germanic customs, and treatment of slaves got markedly worse. Owners were now allowed to kill their slave if the latter fell afoul of the law. Slaves could be transferred arbitrarily, were not allowed to marry, and could even be burned alive if they had sex with a widow, consensual or not. For the coming few centuries, the situation would hardly improve. Kingdoms would rise and fall or stand tall, but Europe remained decentralized, chaotic, and violent, ensuring a constant flow of slaves between borders. Special slave hunting expeditions were often organized on a state level, by kings such as Dagobert of Gascony or the Frankish sons of Clovis. Not only were the slaves put to work on the estates, but sold at slave markets locally or abroad. British slaves might be exported to Iberia, Italy, or even Scandinavia. However, the post-Roman kingdoms could hardly be called slave societies like classical Greece or Rome or the colonial Caribbean. Historians generally believe that a slave society has a slave population of around 30%, whereas in the Dark Age kingdoms, slaves were only a supplementary resource in a pool of free workers, and their usage was much more restricted. And as things started to calm down and the kingdom stabilized, we meet again with the historical trend of slavery being phased out by free or semi-free tenant farming. Serfdom, essentially. However, across the Mediterranean, a new power was rising, which would shake the world's foundations and bring about a new and horrible age of slavery, flying under the green banner of the crescent moon. Between the 7th and 8th centuries, slavery looked like it was once again on the way out of Western Europe, much like it had during the final centuries of the Western Empire. Much of the former empire had been consolidated by the Frankish kingdom. More unity meant more stability, less conflicts meant less slave raiding. The kingdom reached its height under Charlemagne, who was even crowned Roman emperor in 800 AD. The attitudes towards slavery from the Augustus himself are uncertain, but the number of servi in his kingdom seems to have been relatively small, and there were members of his court who urged for reductions in slavery, if only for fellow Christians. However, the 6th and 7th centuries had seen the rapid rise of the Islamic Caliphate, conquering all of the southern Mediterranean, and even toppling the Visigothic kingdom. Though the Franks managed to stop the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, and the Iberian Christians maintained a defined foothold in the north, a violent frontier had been carved between these very different worlds. The taking of religious enemies as slaves was socially acceptable, promoted even. Though the Pope would frequently try to limit the enslavement of fellow Christians, he had no problems with keeping Muslim slaves. In 849, Pope Leo IV had no qualms about enslaving Muslim captives, and using them to construct the Leonine Wall around the Vatican. Unlike medieval Europe, the Muslim world had a much broader employment of slaves. They also had strict prohibitions against the enslavement of fellow Muslims, and very few of the slaves were allowed to reproduce. Those who were often had their children set free, meaning that a constant influx of fresh meat was necessary. Enslaved peoples were used in the traditional fields of labor and crafts, but also as soldiers, concubines, entertainers, business agents, bureaucrats, and even state officials. The latter three were typically eunuchs. These were men, but usually adolescents or even young boys, castrated like farm animals. This reduced the production of the hormone testosterone, making the man calmer and more compliant. By permanently severing his reproductive capabilities, he was unable to create a dynasty, limiting his political ambitions. Thus, the eunuch was the perfect slave, and this detestable practice would persist in the Islamic world well into recent times. The brutality of castration must not be underestimated, and it is one of the most horrific practices of human history, especially when considering the scale on which it was practiced. Just imagine being a young man or a child, stolen against your will from your home and murdered family, or even sold by them, taken by violent people who don't speak your language or understand you or care for you, to a dark and foreign room where grown men press you down against a table and cut off your intimate body parts. This was a time before proper medical procedure, hygiene, and anesthesia. The process would have been slow, unfathomably painful, and the death toll from hemorrhage or infection must have been staggering. Post-operation, there might have been issues with urinating, possibly leading to infection, pain, or even death. All of this to alter who you are as a person and turn you into a complete servant. It was unbelievably cruel and humiliating, and represents the final stage of the dehumanization of slavery, the complete rendering of an individual into an object, a tool. But the use of eunuchs wasn't merely restricted to the caliphate. They were also widely employed in Byzantium. Besides the aura of Christianity and civility, the Byzantines continued the Roman institution of slavery. They were employed in farm work and construction, crafts, the military, and state bureaucracy. This reliance on high demand made the Byzantines some of the most effective slave raiders. Organized by the professional military, Roman dromon would travel up the Adriatic, to the Slavic lands and the Muslim East, pillaging cities, capturing slaves, and using them brutally. The effectiveness of Byzantine enslavement can best be illustrated from a prisoner exchange with the Abbasids in 845. The number of enslaved Muslims was so much higher than the number of Byzantines, so Caliph al-Wathiq had to release slaves sold in Baghdad, and even Byzantine women from his own harem. He was that desperate. But of course, the Byzantines were carrying the torch of Roman and Christian civilization, and critique against the practice would sometimes come from as far up as the emperor. When the city of Kherson was taken in the early 8th century, Emperor Justinian II was outraged over the enslavement of children. Oh wow, it's touching to read something positive, for it was because he had commanded the execution of all of the city's inhabitants and the military defied him to make a profit. Interaction with the Middle East did not only create conflict, but commerce. European lords soon got a taste for the Eastern riches, including silk, glass, and most importantly, silver. Mined in the mountainous regions of the Caliphate, it was a universal currency that allowed any warlord to pay his warriors and consolidate power. Minting his face on a silver coin was a sign of the utmost authority. The Western elite wanted these items, and though they had a few goods the Muslims were willing to buy, especially high-quality Frankish swords, slaves became the most sought-after trade good. The idea of constant hostility and an eternal clash of civilizations between the Christian and Muslim worlds is a myth. The Eastern and Western economies were intertwined and codependent, and based upon the misery of the poor and defenseless. The friendly interaction between these foreign elites can best be exemplified in a letter from the Margravine of Tuscany, Bertha, sent in 905 to the Caliph in Baghdad, al-Muqtafi. She delivered him 50 swords, 50 shields, 50 lances of the type used by the Franks, 20 garments woven with gold, 20 Slav eunuchs, and 20 beautiful and elegant Slav slave girls. Historians believe that the taking of slaves and sale of them on the international market was essential in the consolidation of multiple European kingdoms, including Francia, Poland, and the Moravian kingdom around modern Czechia. The demand for slaves and profitability of it started to affect warfare. Conflict became less about capturing land, but more about raiding your neighbors for slaves. This massive trade route spanned across the entirety of Europe and the Middle East. Slaves could be captured basically everywhere by anyone, but a handful of popular slave raiding regions and centers in the slave trade can be identified. Most slaves were sourced from the British Isles and the Slavic lands of Eastern Europe, roughly between the eastern border of modern Germany and the eastern limit of European Russia. These regions were the most politically fragmentary, and trade posts were set up in the vicinity to collect the slaves and ship them onward. Places like Dublin in Ireland, Jorvik in England, and especially Prague in Moravia one of the biggest slave markets in Europe, as it connected both the East and West. Prague wasn't just some backwater. It was frequented by merchants from all across the known world, of all creeds and colors, and the city was described in travel accounts of Arab and Jewish merchants. From any of these regions, the slaves could either be exported east or west. The eastern trade route either went through Scandinavia and the Baltic Sea, down the rivers of Eastern Europe, and then divided towards the Black Sea and Constantinople, or continued into the Khazar Khaganate, the Caspian Sea, and finally the endpoint in Baghdad. Or it went through the lands of Central Europe, or down the Danube to the east and Byzantium. The British and Moravian starting nodes shared a midpoint in West Francia, what is now France. Moravian slaves were marched overland, whereas British slaves were shipped to Rouen on the northern coast. The most important mutual midpoint was the city of Verdun, a major center of castration. The reason for having castration centers was that you needed experts to perform this very dangerous operation, to reduce casualty rates and increase profits. From Verdun, the slaves were carried onwards to Iberia, where they were shipped onwards to the Caliphate. Iberia was home to the Islamic state of Andalusia, which itself was one of the most slave-dependent regions, and might even be considered a slave society. Estimates of the total slave population ranges between 10 to 20%. Of course, many of their slaves were also taken from Africa, and border conflicts with the Christian kingdoms. The second important collection point was Italy, especially the city of Venice, another castration center. A lot of Slavic slaves were sent here specifically. The Venetians were some of the most vile and duplicitous slave traders of the period. They had no qualms about who they bought, castrated, and sold, and they frequently invoked the ire of the Vatican and Frankish kingdom, since they often acquired Christians and Frankish subjects. Having now covered the high point of European slavery, we can delve into the specifics of the practice. How slaves were acquired, who acquired and owned them, the roles of slaves, how they lived, and the attitudes towards slavery. Firstly, we have to look at what types of people were desired for enslavement. Of course, this depended on whether you wanted to use the slaves personally or export them. Overall, teenagers have always been the most valuable, since they have yet to reach their physical prime, but unlike younger children, can still be put to work. Children were highly desired for the slave trade, and the boys specifically could be castrated and tutored into educated positions. The problem was that the work they could perform was limited and needed time to mature. Older people were the least desired, since they were less likely to survive the journey, could perform less labor, and wouldn't live as long. They were only really sought after if they were experts in a certain field, say an accomplished craftsman, and were thus only seldom exported, but might be more common locally. As for adults, women were generally more valuable than men, and in the written documents, they appear more often as victims of enslavement. The sexual aspect is the most obvious one, but in general, women produce way less testosterone than men, and thus tend to be physically weaker and tend to be more docile, making them easier to subjugate. And female slaves could be given a much broader range of assignments than a man. Men were not expected to perform household work, whereas women could, and would also partake in mostly male assignments like farm labor. We've talked about the capture of slaves in war and raiding, but there are also less violent but equally abhorrent, or even more abhorrent alternatives. Most of the slaves present in the European kingdoms of the Dark Ages had been born into it. Their parents were slaves, and so they were slaves. Slaves could also be gifted, inherited, or included in property that was sold. In some areas, slaves were quite transient. In 11th century Rus, there are written mentions of slaves changing owners as many as 4 times. One of the most reasonable ways in which to get enslaved was if you committed a crime. Enslavement as a punishment was often doled out depending on the demand for slaves. During the height of the slave trade, it could be given for petty trifles like theft, working on a Sunday, or breaking an oath. Just give him a reason. But during most of the period, you usually had to do something more severe like incest, murder, or rape. The enslavement and sale of criminals would have been an efficient way of ridding the community of troublesome individuals. Debt slavery was also common, with some people even selling themselves into slavery. In the latter case, they would probably never be exported abroad, but deployed locally, possibly in a semi-free state, and their conditions were most likely tolerable enough for them to even consider the option. There was also a tragic tendency for parents to sell their own children during times of extreme poverty or starvation. Whilst this certainly could have been done out of cruelty and maliciousness, there are some horrible parents out there. There might be a strange benevolence to it, even if misled, perhaps. Castrated boys would be given educated and privileged positions, and afforded a comfort which most people throughout history could not even imagine. Security, access to entertainment, fashionable clothing, good lodgings, and more than enough food, and good food at that. As for young girls, life as a harem concubine in Al-Andalus was arguably more tolerable than the lives a lot of women lived. They were allowed to move freely in the cities, had access to education, a fuller emotional life, and could manipulate their masters. Their children were often freed, as were the concubines themselves. But of course, this at the expense of sexual exploitation. Under no circumstance should the sale of slaves be justified. These examples were only provided to understand the ways in which parents who sold their own children, a common phenomenon, might have been justified. And the money could be used to improve the lives of their other children, if families were large back then. If anything, this could have been used as propaganda by slave traders. For most parents, we can presume, or perhaps hope, that it would have been a difficult decision. Nevertheless, most slaves were violently captured. You could just be kidnapped by bandits when out on the road, or even in the city. But the overwhelming majority were taken as part of military operations. Slave and capture taking was a fundamental part of early medieval warfare, and based in the cultural perceptions. This was a violent society, might makes right, and the subjugation of your lessers was the highest status. Thus, the enslavement of your opponents and just a matter of owning someone was a prestigious reminder of your own power. This is why slavery had existed and persisted even on a smaller, non-practical scale. Sexual violence is of course an important component of this subjugation and humiliation. It would have been used against the women to remind them of their place, and to humiliate the men of their own people. However, men would also have been victims. This is something the period sources are more sensitive in covering, but a graphic depiction of male-on-male abuse appears in the 11th century poem, Moirut. Male-on-male sexual violence remains a taboo subject today, even if it is becoming more documented. It is an occurring phenomenon within the Russian armed forces, and the amount of studies and reports of Ukrainian male victims being abused in the ongoing conflict is abhorrent. And if this phenomenon occurs in our modern society, it undoubtedly was a facet of the much more brutal and unforgiving early Middle Ages. Aside from the psychological, the taking of captives had an economic effect, the bereaving of the enemy's resources and the improvement of your own. A large part of pre-modern warfare consisted of taking livestock, portable wealth, and destroying the enemy's crops and buildings. An example is necessary. According to Bernold of Constance, writing of Henry IV's Swabian campaign in 1077, Bohemian troops specifically targeted people instead of livestock, since they could be raped and sold. This became especially tragic and horrifying during periods of civil war and internal friction, such as in 9th century Germany, following the death of Charlemagne. However, not all of the captives taken were actually enslaved. Most of them were ransomed, and army commanders were expected to keep their subjects, and especially warriors, safe from enslavement, by buying their freedom. High-status individuals were especially valuable for ransom. In 869, the Archbishop of Arles was ransomed for 150 pounds of silver, 150 swords, 150 cloaks, and 150 slaves, if you ever wondered how many souls a clergyman was worth. If the ransom wasn't paid, even the noble risked being shackled. I think Roland, the Archbishop, was taken by Vikings, and indeed, slavery against peoples of other ethnicities and especially religions was the most tolerated. Even then, the raiders and warriors of the Dark Ages did not discriminate. Christians enslaved fellow Christians and would even go so far as to raid monasteries and enslave clergymen. According to the life of Clement, written in Greek but based on a lost Slavonic text, a Moravian monastery was raided in 885 under the direction of Vishing, bishop of Nitra. The churches were plundered, priests attacked, the elders left in the wilderness, and the young students being captured and taken to Venice. Another perfect example of the interreligious chaos can be provided from 873, when Muslim raiders struck the Tyrrhenian coast of Italy and carried off dozens of Lombard Christians, who were destined for the slave markets of North Africa. The Byzantine fleet intervened and attacked the ship, killed the Muslims, but they then kept the Lombard captives. After the attack, the Byzantines sold their captives to slave traders on Sardinia, who in turn resold many of the Lombards back to the Muslims, despite the protestations of Pope John VIII. Nor was there any superior master race of enslavers, even though the Scandinavian Vikings tend to be recognized as the master slavers. Even their people were victims of the Irish, Estonians, the Slavic Wends, and themselves. And this was true for all European peoples. Everyone enslaved everyone. After the slaves had been acquired, they were picked up by slave traders, a very ambiguous position. The line between warrior, raider, merchant, and slave trader was often unclear, and slaves often changed hands between multiple parties along the same road, and the traders would also ship other goods than just slaves. The slaves might be given as gifts or used as a means of exchange to acquire other items or services. Anyone of any religion or nationality could be a slave trader, but during the height of the slave trade, between the 9th and 10th centuries, two distinct groups are the most spoken of: Scandinavians and Jews. This period isn't most often called the Viking Age without a reason. Even still, it must become clear at this point that the Vikings merely adapted themselves to the existing trade route and demand for slaves. They did not invent slavery or revolutionize it, even if they had a large impact in the Isles especially, and drove up demand with the colonization of Iceland. They were some of the most effective raiders and middlemen, and I will save that discussion for a future video on the Viking slave trade. Jewish merchants were some of the most noted participants of the medieval slave trade. And part of the reason is the fact that a lot of written mentions of slavery concern outrage over non-Christians enslaving Christians, so naturally the Jews would get additional attention in that regard. But it must not be underestimated how prominent they were across the known world. One of their big advantages was the diaspora. Jewish communities could be found in almost every kingdom around the Mediterranean and its peripheries, meaning that Jewish merchants could easily set up relations with foreign lands. A prime example lies in Khazaria, a Turkic Judaic state, which had frequent correspondence with Andalusia, where Jewish slave traders were especially prominent. When dealing with Christians and Muslims, the Jewish religion might even be a benefit. They were a neutral party between these alleged rivals. It must also be noted that, unlike the Vikings, Jews only ever appear to have acted as middlemen, merchants. They never raided for slaves, and it doesn't seem as if they were especially involved in castration. They were even absent from the castration capital of Verdun. Even still, Jewish slavers had some problems to contend with. Christian kingdoms would often impose a special tax on them, and in some places they were forbidden from owning household slaves. So whilst it can't be argued that Jews ran the medieval slave trade, they were one of the biggest participants, and when Al-Andalus collapsed into multiple states in the 11th century, the trade of Slavic slaves virtually disappeared from Iberia, and the Jewish merchant activity declined. When we hear slave owner, we usually have a very specific image of a lazy and decadent upper class of noblemen, but slave owners in the Middle Ages were much broader. Anyone with a modicum of money could own one, and it was a mark of wealth and high status. In Ireland, the slaves were owned by noblemen, poets, and druids. In the urban environment, slaves were a must-have for well-off households. Slaves could be owned by craftsmen, peasants, or even serfs. In a 9th century deed from St. Gall, a serf granted 5 of his own slaves to the monastery in exchange for his own freedom, and that of his wife and children. But farm work was still difficult, and the life wasn't easy, even if you owned slaves. Analysis of the skeletons of wealthy women in Dark Age Moravia shows that they performed the same physical labor as poor people, such as grinding grain, weaving, and hauling. These women would undoubtedly have owned slaves, but worked alongside them. One of the largest slaveholding groups in medieval Europe may come as a surprise: the Church. Bishops were able to own large tracts of land, often worked by several hundreds or even thousands of slaves. Far from free of earthly sin, clergymen would often take slave women as concubines. As late as 1092, the canon of the Synod of Chabox punished a priest who lived with a slave concubine. If he was discovered unpunished, how many went undiscovered or unpunished? The fact that the Church actively supported slavery might seem strange to us today, when we associate Christianity with kindness and mercy, and slavery with cruelty and humiliation. Throughout history, believers and non-believers have competed over finding justifications for or against slavery in the Bible. From reading history, it becomes apparent that Christians will interpret the Bible to best suit their own agenda. In the 4th and 5th centuries, early Christian writers like John Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, and St. Augustine himself were all critical of the reviving slave trade. They bemoaned how Roman slave traders would cannibalize the empire's own population by attacking remote villages, carrying off the people, only to sell them in other parts of the empire. In the subsequent century, the Church would take an official pro-slavery stance, when Pope Gregory I argued that the hierarchy of legal status mirrored the hierarchy of sinfulness. Thus, a slave was deemed to be a sinful person, and their status the will of God. As late as 916, the Council of Altheim drew a parallel between the slave who fled his master and the churchman who abandoned God. Both were seen as equally detestable. Slavery was seen as a natural part of the societal fabric. In the aforementioned instance of the Byzantine emperor raging over the enslavement instead of execution of captives, the Church argued that the enslavement was an act of mercy, since it spared the Christian souls. However, cracks soon started to appear in the logic of sin and slavery. Raiding, warfare, captive taking, and poverty made almost anyone potentially enslavable, regardless if they were a saint or a sinner. Furthermore, some authors were concerned with the sin that slavery might induce. Enslaved women and their owners might commit adultery, and Christians enslaved by non-Christians might have a lapse of faith. The biggest critique of slavery was not against the institution itself, but the idea of non-Christians owning Christian slaves. This sentiment appeared as early as the 5th century, when Bishop, later Saint Patrick, wrote a letter condemning a Christian Britain for selling recent converts to pagans. Over the course of the 7th and 8th centuries, Christian religious identity began to become more important than local or ethnic identities, at least within high society, and the church became increasingly concerned with the non-Christian enslavement of Christians. The church managed to at least get a few rulers on their side. The role of a Christian king was to protect his people, and them becoming enslaved by religious enemies became of increasing concern. In 656, the Visigothic kingdom outlawed the sale of Christian slaves to Jews, and during the 8th century, enslavement of Christians was on its way out of the Frankish kingdom. But overall, the sentiment of the church was not strong enough to prevent fellow Christians from enslaving and selling each other to pagans and Muslims in places like Germany and the British Isles. Most people would maintain the old tribal mentality, and it would take centuries for inter-Christian sympathy to take precedence over this mentality. Of course, during this time, the church had no qualms about the enslavement and sale of pagans and Muslims. It was an ancient tradition to differentiate slaves from free people by marking them. It included the cutting of ears, branding with a hot iron, or tattooing the owner's name onto the slave's body. In the Muslim world, slaves could be marked by having their nostrils slit. This facial marking seems to have persisted in post-Roman times, and it was common to chop off the nose, sometimes the ears, a foot, a hand, the tongue, or the lips. There is even evidence that slaves were scalped. That is, they did not just have their heads shaved, but the roots of their hair were torn out. In Anglo-Saxon England, slave women were distinguished from free women by having their hair cut off. Another distinguishing physical mark were the scars of abuse, flogging, beatings. Not only did these beatings serve the purpose of punishment, but more importantly, to dominate and suppress. Many slaves must have considered their options for escaping, or even rising up against their masters, like the legendary Spartacus. These stories would have been unknown to the uneducated medieval slave, and stories of slaves rebelling are next to none. In one of the Icelandic sagas, Egil's saga, a group of Irish slaves rise up and loot the local area. That's about it. This is not to say that slave uprisings never happened. If they did, they were most likely on a small scale. Rebelling might not even be a preferable option, because what are you gonna do next? European slaves never seem to have formed a large enough percentage to be able to accomplish anything significant. If one was discontent with their status and willing to take the risk, escape was a better option. Written legislation describing the punishment for escapes makes it clear that it was common enough, and there are documented cases of it occurring. Runaway slaves would typically seek refuge with a neighboring rival of their former master. For example, Anglo-Saxon slaves were known for joining the Viking invaders. Escaped slaves might be able to provide valuable intelligence, in return for a higher status than previously. Even just encouraging your enemy slaves to escape and join you would be a good way of destabilizing their society. However, if a runaway was caught, they might expect a harsh penalty. The Anglo-Saxons punished runaway slaves by stoning them. A master might undertake other, more devious options to control their slaves. The slave had to be made dependent on their master, and make any alternatives unfeasible. This is why it was preferable to have foreign slaves, because local slaves could more easily escape and integrate into nearby communities of their own culture. A master could even try to force social bonds upon the slave within their community. In 8th century Bavaria, a master pressured one of his victims, an older man, to marry the widow of one of his former slaves. If the man refused, the master threatened to sell him to the pagan Saxons. Slaves in Europe could be given a vast range of assignments. The absolute bulk would have been work slaves employed in livestock herding and field work. Their autonomy varied. Some possessed their own houses and might even have subordinate slaves, whereas others Typically those who performed heavier duties like plowing were more akin to the stereotypical slave. Women were the most desired slaves, since they could perform a much wider range of tasks than men, both agricultural and domestic. Writing from 12th century Hungary, a Muslim visitor named Abu Hamid al-Andalusi al-Garnati purchased a 15-year-old concubine who was skilled in cooking, sewing, and embroidery. Slave women worked as nurses, milkmaids, weavers, seamstresses, tasks which men did not perform, in addition to being useful in agricultural labor. Women were just more flexible. That is besides the sexual element. Pure sex slaves were uncommon, the economic assignments were more important, but the sexual aspect was still present. Abuse of female slaves was endemic, and their use in producing additional slaves or even heirs to the abuses was regarded as a benefit. However, sexual and reproductive bonds could be used in the slave woman's favor. Some might position themselves as the personal concubine of an influential master, and might eventually secure their own freedom, or that of their child. Male slaves might also find themselves in a better position than the common laborer, provided they had a particular skill. The range of assignments provided to slaves is staggering, almost anything you could think of. In the middle of the 8th century, the Duke of Bavaria donated several beekeepers, 3 blacksmiths, a cook, and a winemaker to the local monastery. In 908, a bishop acquired a smith, a potter, a baker, and a fisherman. The will of an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman named Athelgifu manumitted a huntsman, a miller, a goldsmith, and exceptionally, a priest. These examples show that certain slaves could be entrusted with expensive materials and important positions. And indeed, pre-modern slavery is difficult to compare to the early modern variant, in that slaves were not equal. Some had more freedoms than others, and slave autonomy existed on a complicated continuum, based both on their own personal circumstance and social relations, their assignment, and various local legal definitions. In Spain, a distinction was made between highly qualified slaves, idueni, and the mass of working slaves, vili. In France, there was a distinction between the slaves who owned houses and those who didn't. Certain slaves were allowed to save up money and could even buy their own freedom. Freedom in the Middle Ages was a complicated matter, and in some regards, no individual was regarded as truly free, especially not in our modern definition of freedom. Everyone was dependent on their social relations. This can best be observed in how the word vassal, referring to any subject to a master, including high noblemen like dukes subject to a king, stems from an old term for an enslaved person. Even kings were dependent on the goodwill of their noble vassals and free farmers. And in the end, everyone, from lowly slave to high monarch, was equal before God. Louis the Pious himself said that he was equal before his subjects. Then again, neither he nor any of his colleagues were ever willing to relinquish any of that divine authority. Even though the slave trade reared its ugly head in the 9th century, domestic slavery was slowly disappearing from Western Europe at the same time, in a process usually known as the feudal revolution. It is a remarkable phenomenon in the history of mankind, but rather than being some ideological or philosophical idea or act of charity, mercy, like modern abolitionism, it was the logical consequence at the confluence of multiple societal, philosophical, and economic developments. Slavery flourishes in periods of decentralization, where local conflict leads to large-scale kidnapping and trafficking. At the end of the early Middle Ages and into the High Period, the kingdoms of Europe became more centralized, stable, and solidified. Starting in the 8th century and ending in the 13th, this process resulted in the borders we can more or less recognized today. Of course, conflict both within and outside of these borders would persist, but societal attitudes towards fellow Christians and warfare itself had changed. Around the 7th century, it became taboo to sell Christians to non-Christians. Between the 10th and 11th centuries, it became taboo to enslave fellow Christians. And by the 13th, it had become taboo to even own fellow Christians. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, became increasingly trendy. The pagans regarded it as an act of pity, the Christians as an act of piety. And as Christian identity became more important, acts like these became more popular. This process coincided with the development of chivalry in what is now France, which replaced the old notions of tribal, honor-based warfare. Captive taking was no longer a part of warfare, with prisoners either being ransomed or executed. Then there were the economic developments. As we talked about previously, harsh, large-scale slavery is dependent on a constant influx of fresh meat to sustain the slave population. And as endemic warfare and captive taking declined, the supply of slaves decreased. Thus, it became more profitable for masters to treat their slaves better. This coincided with improvements in agriculture, which also made it more profitable to have free farmers or tenants upon the feudal estates. Since the slaves already existed on a sliding scale of autonomy, the transition of slave to serf was quite smooth. This can be observed in the word serf itself, which, as previously described, stemmed from servus. It appears that in the late Dark Ages, servi had come to mean slaves who occupied their own farms. So, the jump to a semi-free tenant wasn't very far, and the semantic shift just as natural. The transition from slave to free or semi-free never tends to be radical, but a slow process. In the medieval context, it is understandable, since people were more dependent on social relations and relations to a protector. So if a slave was to be freed, they would usually discuss a new contract with their master. This new term of servitude might be permanent, or it might be temporary. This can best be observed in an example from Valencia in 1301. A slave named Francesca was granted conditional freedom by her owner and his wife, on the condition that she would serve them for a term of 3 years, during which they would provide food and drink, clothing and shoes. At the same time, at the dawn of the High Middle Ages in the 11th century, the slave trade was disappearing out of Western Europe. The aforementioned decline of captive taking was one of the prominent reasons, which seems to have completely disappeared by 1100. The Scandinavians were Christianized and made no further attempts on England after around 1080, leading to a complete decline of sea raids in Western Europe, even though they would continue on a smaller scale in parts of Britain, and especially in the Baltic Sea. Most importantly, the Islamic desire for slaves began to decline with the collapse of a unified Al-Andalus in 1009. Decentralization and constant infighting and conflict with the Christian neighbors gave them less purchasing power to buy foreign slaves, and less of an ability to export slaves to the rest of the Mediterranean. In the Middle East, the once powerful Abbasid Caliphate had likewise fragmented into multiple local states. Perhaps most importantly, Christianity and Islam became more antagonistic towards each other, finally culminating in the Crusades. This religious conflict would basically continue until the 18th century, and though slavery and captive taking had virtually disappeared from Western Europe, it would continue in the Mediterranean throughout that period. Indeed, it isn't true that slavery disappeared completely from Europe. Even in Western and Central Europe, slavery would persist into the 13th and possibly 14th centuries. But slaves had now largely become a sort of luxury item. In private property, domestic servants for the upper class to brag about their subjugation of other people. And as aforementioned, slavery would never disappear from the Mediterranean countries, nor had the slave trade ever completely disappeared, it just died down. The Muslim world was still dependent on a steady influx of slaves, and the Venetians were still happy to supply them in whatever ways they could. In Central and Western Europe, captive taking had become trivial, but individuals could still be kidnapped and trafficked. Slave traders and raiders would also look for new opportunities and markets. The Great Schism between Catholic Christianity and Orthodoxy could potentially make fellow Christians susceptible to enslavement. The Catalan Company, a mercenary group usually employed in Greece, were especially known for capturing Orthodox Christians and Muslim Turks, and selling them to other Muslims or Venetians. The Genovese managed to establish a trade post in Crimea, one of the nodes in the eastern trade route. Slaves were still an important component in Rus trade, and peoples like the Estonians and Novgorodians would raid their neighbors for slaves, including the Volga Bulgarians and later Tatars, Finland and Scandinavia. In turn, the Rus lands were attacked by nomadic horse warriors, the captives dragged off to be sold in the Black Sea markets. With the supply of slaves decreasing from Europe, the Muslims began to look elsewhere. Africa became a very important source of slaves up until the 19th century, a fact often forgotten in favor of the transatlantic trade, largely because the Muslims would castrate their African slaves, meaning that they don't have many living descendants in the Fertile Crescent. Slavery remains a problem in the wealthier countries of the Middle East. The agricultural improvements which led to the feudal revolution resulted in a food surplus, a growing population, and freed up work that allowed for urbanization. The urban population was less likely to marry, but there was still a large demand for intimacy, resulting in the growth of institutionalized prostitution in the form of the brothel. Much like today, the sex trade was dependent on the poverty, physical and emotional abuse of the working women, and trafficking, again, much like today, was crucial to the industry. The high to late Middle Ages was the golden age of European prostitution, and it wouldn't be cracked down upon until the Protestant Reformation, when lustfulness became more taboo after the church was essentially caught in multiple sex scandals. This is a very deep topic that will be tackled in a future video. Urbanization was especially prominent in northern Italy, and the wealthy middle and upper classes not only had a desire for prostitutes, but for domestic servants in their homes. This led to a sort of slavery renaissance, with slaves brought in from Russia, the Middle East, and Africa. The Black Death of the 14th century was also a huge contributor to the rise of Mediterranean slavery, since the lower class survivors were able to ask for higher wages and better conditions, leading to many masters seeking cheap and expendable laborers. This became especially prominent in Italy and Spain, the latter of whom had been practicing slavery of Muslims throughout the Middle Ages. In the 14th and 15th centuries, they even began to purchase a trickle of Africans, and African slaves would be present on the missions of exploration around Africa and across the Atlantic. Slaves had already been used in the harvesting of sugar in Muslim Al-Andalus, and upon the early Iberian colonies in Madeira and the Canary Islands, foreshadowing the plantation economies of colonial America. Even though England and France had abandoned slavery, their pirates would see the profitability in smuggling African slaves to the labor-starved Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and would then imitate the practice in their own colonies of the 17th century. Many of the early colonial slaves had been taken from Iberian colonies, since they knew how to cultivate tobacco and sugar. These slaves were the first African Americans, and thus we can see a direct continuation between the Roman institution of slavery through the medieval period into the 19th century, and perhaps even today. This video has been expansive and largely served as the starting episode to my new series on medieval slavery. Upcoming episodes will focus on slavery and the slave trade in Scandinavia, in Russia, maybe in Iberia and the Mediterranean, I'm not sure, and then an episode on the medieval sex trade. If you enjoy these videos, make sure to click the subscribe button and notification bell, otherwise YouTube is kinda reluctant to show you the videos. And if you want to support me monetarily, that would be greatly appreciated. Consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member.